Hello, welcome everyone. I, Councilmember Hunt, call the May 3rd, 2022 City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee to order. This meeting will be conducted in person and virtually in compliance with the Governor's proclamation related to the COVID-19 emergency and open public meetings. There are multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There is a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer periods on tonight's agenda items. Members of the public may address council at this time, as the first item on our agenda is public comment. Those who are signed up in advance to make comments will be called on first. If you are joining us virtually and would like to make comments, please raise your virtual hand. If you are on the phone, press *3. And if you have joined by computer or smartphone, look for the hand icon. This varies by device. One option may be to go to the participant panel and choose the raise hand icon in the lower right-hand corner. And I do not see anyone in the room, so I will skip past any in-person opportunities unless somebody comes into the room. And at this time, we'll check in with City Clerk. Has anyone indicated a desire to give public comment at this time?
Yes, Councilmember Hunt. Susan Neville is attending virtually and would like to speak. Ms. Neville, I'm making you a panelist. You should now see the option to unmute, and you may also turn on your video.
Hello.
Hello.
Just through? Good. Hello, everybody. Thank you, council members, for volunteering to lead this important project. I know it's going to be a long one, but with lots of good things. Based on recent confusion concerning when a meeting is closed to the public comments, will someone be speaking to the parameters concerning this new type of workshop meeting we're having this evening and going forward? And then my other question was, will public comments today that was turned in be included in the total packet as we move forward? I had another issue I wanted to discuss too, was I'm just reiterating what I had sent in regarding tree canopy, the important tree canopy changes that were put in place as you review this draft this evening. But please keep in mind, we do not have a specific person or area who are going to monitor these changes, such as protecting our current canopy was a big one. And also the target goal of 55% in 8 years, and keeping tabs on the number of trees being removed and replaced, and most importantly, where they are being removed and replaced, to guarantee we have the right tree in the right place, which is a big initiative that you will see as we speak more to this. I just want to reiterate, it was brought up many times, but not included in the packet today. And I don't even know if a position or a system that we're speaking of would be placed in the code changes, but even a PPC committee member suggested including something of this type into the actual code. And I just wanted to share that with you and look forward to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Has anyone else indicated a desire to speak at this time?
Councilmember Hunt, I see no further hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. Then with that, I will move on to ID 1043, Title 18 Landscape and Open Space Review. This will be led by this will be led by Director of Community Planning and Development, Minnie Dollywall. So I'll hand it over to Minnie.
Good evening, council members and members of the public. I am going to bring up this presentation real quick on my screen. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Great. So can you make me a presenter? Let's see, share application. Thank you. Can everyone see my screen with the presentation? Perfect. So today we're seeking input from the newly formed Planning, Development, and Environment Committee, the first meeting of the committee, on the draft Title 18 Landscape, Open Space, and Tree Regulations. Specifically, we're asking if there are any additional considerations that PPC should study prior to finalizing their recommendations to City Council. And really, we're looking for direction whether the proposed changes meet the goals and outcomes intended for these topics, or if there are any additional topics for us to consider when we're making the final edits to the draft code. There are 3 subtopics under this bigger topic of landscape and open space, and they are community spaces and green necklace, tree preservation, and landscaping. The goals and outcomes for these topics were retaining 55% of the canopy coverage that was established by the ICAP that the council adopted in December of 2021, retaining neighborhood charm, ensuring sustainable development and climate goals, and also implementing park strategic plan and green necklace. And where we are in the process, we had our first phase, which was the gaps analysis, which was jointly Planning Policy Commission, Park Board, Environmental Board discussed. That discussion and public comments informed the first draft. Then we had the draft released, an open house on the draft, public hearings, and then Planning and Policy Commission deliberation. And today we're here to bring forth PPC's recommended first draft and changes that we are going to incorporate. Moving forward, after all of this, we intend to have a combined hearing on the combined draft at PPC, and then the formal City Council review and adoption process will start later this year. The information that we included in the packet was the summary of the proposed changes, how they align with the goals and outcome. We included links to the Planning and Policy Commission, including those packets included detailed comment tracking matrix that included the comments we received, the responses, and so on. We also included a summary of the Environmental Board recommendation and the Planning Policy Commission and joint boards and commission meeting minutes. Also in your packet is a public feedback loop matrix that includes how we went from getting the initial feedback, how we incorporated in the draft, what the highlights of the comments were on the public draft, and what the next steps are going to be. Also included was the draft code. We did annotate in the draft code and the blue boxes the items that we intend to incorporate and fix with the second draft. So the first topic, community space and green necklace. As you can see, the first box over here shows how it's split in different sections of the code and different documents. So it's in the municipal code, 1807. It's in the replacement regulations for Highlands and Talus. Then we have the Central Issaquah Design Development Standards. We have a park strategic plan. We have the Central Issaquah plan and the Urban Design Manual. So all of this stuff is going to be incorporated into this one chapter that intends to implement the park strategic plan and consolidate all of these sections into one chapter. Some of the key changes, there's some new terms that we've formed in here. Obviously, we're going to take a look at it and get your feedback on whether these make sense. But open space was a different term under the parks plan and so on and so forth. So what we've come up with is an amenity area and a community space. I'll get into those in a little bit. And looking at the park strategic plan and seeing where the requirements are for green necklace and what those mean in terms of regulations and how those can be implemented with when we get development over a longer period of time. So community space is really public outdoor area that's developed that we get as part of the development, but it's open to general public. So an example is a plaza. Outdoor space for private use is called natural amenity space. This could be an example of a patio courtyard for an apartment building. Indoor amenity obviously could be recreation room in a multifamily complex. The other thing that's included in this chapter is building orientation or connection. So looking at the Green Necklace vision, this chapter will include a new map that shows city-owned parks, not just in the central Issaquah, but throughout the city, open space and connections between the parks. And it requires, when we get development for property adjacent to these amenities, to take certain actions. So if you are a property next to a map that shows a shared public use route, so Mountains to Sound Greenway route, then you have to develop that as part of your frontage improvements. Or if there is a development next to a trail connection, you have to provide that trail connection. Or if you are a development right next to a park, or then you have to orient and design your building so that you don't have blank walls along the parks. You actually have more of a context of development around it. Here's a map that shows what we've taken from the park strategic map, looking at the other maps, parks that the city has. Obviously, some more refinement and description of what type 1, type 2, type 3 means, and bringing that forward from the park strategic plan. So we'll fine tune this map, but this is the map in this draft. So based on all the feedback that we received, here's some things that we're going to incorporate in moving forward. The map, like I said, we're going to ensure it captures the entire city, includes a legend that actually explains the different types of connections. And then looking at the building orientation section, one of the feedback from the park board was there are different types of parks, so an active, passive, or just a conservation area. We're going to take a stab at having a more nuanced approach to what building orientation means based on the type of park. There were public comments on balconies should not count towards common amenity space requirements. So right now, under the existing code, there's a requirement for residential to have 48 square feet per unit, and you can choose whether you can have it all as a private open space or all as common open space. So based on the feedback, the direction from Planning and Policy Commission is that the balconies is in addition to your common open space, that you shouldn't get to count your balconies towards your required common open space. So obviously this means, looking at really what that number is, how does it play out between private and common open space. So we'll come up with standards that don't allow balconies to be counted towards common open space.
Director Dhaliwal,
Yep.
we have a question if you might
Just
pause.
very briefly.
Yep.
So when we talk about balconies, and I kind of get up to speed really fast on this, but what about a patio, something at ground level? Does that same things apply, or is it treated differently?
Yeah, I think the idea here was if it's just private open space or common open space. So there was a desire to not let the private open space be counted towards meeting your common open space requirements. So patio would be the same as.
A balcony. Perfect, thank you.
The next one is really amenity spaces for non-residential or mixed-use development. And in here, I think one of the commissioners had asked, perhaps this should be expanded to citywide. So I went back and looked at exactly what it says in the draft code. So the existing code and the draft code only has these natural amenity spaces for non-residential mixed use in Central Issaquah, Talus, or Issaquah Highlands. So, but there isn't that much land outside of these areas that really allows non-residential. So the discussion at the Planning and Policy Commission was, do we really want to change the policy and go beyond these 3 areas to allow to require amenity spaces for non-residential developments? At the time, I think my response, and you've heard some public comments on that, was we're not doing more of a policy change with this code update, so perhaps that's something we can look at in the future, but really, it's not that big a deal if you want to make it citywide, because there isn't that much area outside of central Issaquah, Talus, or Highlands that you can do non-residential. But, one example would be intensive commercial, which isn't a walkable pedestrian kind of so having a plaza in those spaces didn't really make a whole lot of sense, and so we had left it not changing the basic code requirements with this consolidation exercise. So that's one item that you've heard public comments on that were emailed to you tonight. The other things were, I think one of the commissioners wanted us to look at roof amenity to see if sports fields could be added to be allowed as a rooftop amenity. So we'll look at that. The other things were more for senior assisted living, that perhaps there was some fine tuning of the requirements needed for those. Some desire to have maintenance of plaza, things like snow removal as a required code. Something related to maintenance, related to weather issues. And then, of course, some confusion with the terms, definitions, and how these required spaces are reviewed. So obviously, we'll look at all of that. So that pretty much is the community spaces. I have an example here to share with you what this really means on the ground. So here's a site that abuts a city park. It's shown on that map along Holly Street as a Mountains to Sound Greenway connection. So with this new code, we would require the frontage along Holly Street to meet, for them to provide that frontage that meets that minimum width design for that overall connection. It also abuts a park. The existing code and the new code will have a requirement for a cross-block connection, which you see on the south side here, and then orientation of this building towards this park would not be a blank space. So those are the red arrows. One's a through block connection. The other one is the orientation. Along the Holly Street, along your left side would be the connection required from the map. And then 48 square feet per unit is the amenity space. So they could do it as a combination under this current draft, as in balconies for each one of these units, or they could have a rooftop common amenity area, or they could have an amenity area right next to the park. And if this was more than 22 plus units, they would need an additional 400 square feet of open space. And if it was an assisted living senior housing, it would have an additional 48 square feet of indoor amenity space per unit. And that pretty much concludes that topic. I don't know if you want to pause for discussion.
I will check in. I think that would be, maybe not for discussion, but maybe for questions, since there's a number of sections, and then we'll take
Sure.
public comments and then do discussion on the different sections. So I did have some questions. Okay. And I'll keep an eye on the chat in case Council President Walsh has any questions on this section. So my first question, you showed the map and of the green necklace, and I wondered, you said it's from a number of different plans, and how ultimately to apply it, I imagine you would need the street level, where do these connections actually happen, because the map, although it is clarified from what I've seen as earlier versions where there's fuzzier lines, it's still not, it seems, at this street level where you would need to put these connections. So how would a developer actually use that to know if they're along this corridor and would need to adhere to the green necklace specifications?
Sure, no, good question. So the earlier map that you're referring to is in the park strategic map, which is these bubbles. And so we've taken that and worked with the Parks Department and our GIS folks to kind of create this. So this is at a parcel level. It'll be a GIS layer. So you could search your property and see if it shows up anything on it. That's our intent, that would be how it would be implemented. And so it is at a parcel level. You should be able to, zoom in. For the code, it shows up at a zoomed out scale, so you can't really see the parcels, but, yeah.
Okay, great. So that's a refinement that staff would do from those existing plans that have the more fuzzy guidelines?
Yeah, so
Okay.
this is more parcel-based. That was more, general. But in terms of implementation, it'll be a GIS layer.
Okay. Great, thank you for that. So on the natural amenities and the question, or the comments that you made about Central and the Central Issaquah, the Highlands, and Talus, it seems that we have at least green necklace components in other areas in some of these maps. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I fully understand.
I think the
question.
green necklace
Uh-huh.
concept extends beyond Central Issaquah and the
Yeah.
Highlands and Talus. Is that correct?
Well, I think the park strategic plan talks about green necklace sort of more focused on central. So perhaps maybe we don't need to use it, some of the discussion we're having with Parks Department is perhaps we don't use the word green necklace because it's adding to the confusion of whether it's just central or it's citywide. So it's connections between the parks citywide. My understanding is that the park strategic plan was more of a focus on the central Issaquah where green necklace term was used. But I could be wrong.
Okay. That isn't my understanding, but I think that would be good to look into. And it is fuzzy on that map, but I think that would be good. And since we have this open question about application of this beyond Central, Highlands, and Talus, I think that would be good to check. I would like it to comply with the existing plans. Then, I wondered how. Surely other cities have terms for public areas, and so I wondered about this natural amenity, if it's something that's used in other cities' codes, and if it would be something that people would recognize and understand sort of intuitively, or if it's something unique to us.
Yeah, well, I think everyone calls it a slightly different, but, recreation spaces, some people call it that. Open spaces is a pretty common term. I think there was some confusion between open spaces, how they're determined under the parks plan, and so this was an attempt to not confuse the two. But we're open to feedback. Did it, once we have the definitions, were the terms confusing? When you guys were reading it, was it obvious or?
Well, I'm more a question about how common the term is from the perspective of a developer or a person who's looking
take a
to
look.
interport the code.
Yeah, we'll take a look if we can
It was new to
standardize it.
me.
Yeah,
I will offer that.
Yeah.
Okay. One other question. So there's a lot of, you mentioned this private versus public differentiation. Is there anything in the code currently that requires the signage or indication that it's public?
It does. But in practice, some of these public spaces don't quite work that way, and that has not, sometimes the signage is there, but it's so small, it's not obvious, but more so than signage, it's the design and the location. So if it's not really abutting a public realm, nobody gets into a complex to figure out that this is a public space. So that's sort of an issue, I think, that came to light when we did the tour, that some of these spaces aren't obvious to general public that they're open to them.
Okay, and that wasn't something that's
We've
changed
addressed here.
specifically. It's addressed by design, but not by the signage component in this
Correct,
update.
but we
Okay.
can strengthen it. We can look at, strengthening the design aspects of public spaces.
Okay, well, I will save my comments on that, but thank you for those answers. And I see Council President Walsh also has a question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to follow up on some of the questions that Councilmember Hunt was saying, because those were kind of my core questions around this idea, which is, first of all, does our current code have a requirement for a certain amount of either indoor or outdoor private amenity space in multifamily units? Or is that something that we're introducing as a new concept here?
So the current code, the existing code has a 48 square feet per unit requirement, but you can choose to make it all public or all private, but there's no combination. You can't say some of it is public and some of it is private. So that's just the way it's written and implemented. You can just put balconies on each one, 6 feet by 8 feet, and you've met your requirement. Or you get all of it together as a common space and you don't have the balconies. So that's just the way it's written right now.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
And in practice, what have we seen development do then? Is it typically, do we see, 80% or more are using private spaces? What has been the situation?
So some of the comments we received from, I think Christy from Rowley had made a comment about the balconies, that based on the new energy code for the buildings, these are very hard to meet. The balconies add another layer of complexity for energy code requirements. And then penetration, the weather issues, it's just, they're harder. In terms of what the market demands, a lot of these apartment buildings that we've seen have rooftop amenities. I mean, the residents are really, and it changes and varies over time too, what may be more kind of desirable. A lot of apartment complexes now, in order to attract, do have these amenities, whether it's a rooftop, common areas, or indoor recreation type of facilities. So it can vary based on, but from a code perspective, I think the decision or more research, what we're going to do is whether private and common, if we want to separate those two, what's the right standard for each one in terms of square foot per unit.
Okay, but my question was, what are we seeing in development? Not just, I appreciate including the comments from the Rowley perspective of it's difficult to develop balconies given the building requirements and such, but with our current code, what have we seen developers do?
I think in general, for the ones that I'm familiar with that are currently under process, they're going to do more of a common space than the balcony approach. So we have 2 under review that I'm familiar with. Yeah.
Okay, and then the second question, going back to some of the things Councilmember Hunt was saying, what is the standard in our other neighboring communities about requirements in multifamily residential units for private communal space versus community open space that's available to the larger community?
Yeah, that's the research we will have to do with the second draft, because I think in the first draft, the focus was to consolidate and not change the standards. And so given this desire to have a separate requirement for balconies, we will have to kind of look at that. They really vary all over the spectrum. But we'll have to kind of take a look at, some cities haven't updated the code, so they're based on a little bit percent, older standards where it was more of a garden style apartments. Now you have more of an urban scape, bigger buildings. The standard's different. Some have a percentage of the gross floor area. Some have per unit requirements. So they're all over the spectrum. But we will research that with the second draft and make a recommendation.
Okay, then that brings me into this question of what is this process then like when we're providing feedback, when the community is providing feedback at PPC and joint board and commission meetings, and we're kind of developing this set of ideas of these are the types of things that are going to need to be in a second draft. What is the community's ability to then, if we're making comments here, can the community then continue to provide comments based on our comments? Because there was some question at the previous meetings about the limitations regarding a public hearing. So can you talk me through what that process looks like?
Well, I think the process is at this stage, we're asking, the scope of the update was not to go and redo the amount of open space required for spaces, right? So it was more in terms of how do we implement the park strategic plan? I think in the first draft, we took the different scattered requirements in all different places and put them in one place. Based on the feedback that we heard at this time on that we need to look at private versus public space and have separate standards. When we do that research, we're obviously going to include that as part of the second consolidated draft and make a recommendation. So there will be an opportunity for public comment at that time, and then the council will then review the final recommendation from PPC. So there will be additional opportunities as part of that consolidated draft. Did
Okay,
that
I
answer
think
your
those are
question?
my questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Council President Welsh. And I will add, too, that we also receive email comments at any time, and those are also included in our decision-making process. So that's another way that there's opportunity for getting comments to us. Okay, I think we are good to proceed.
Okay. So for the next topic. Okay, so the next one is the tree chapter. So previously, the tree and the landscaping chapter were intermingled, so this is a separate section now. Some of the key changes really are tree canopy coverage goals replace the minimum tree density. And what does this really mean? So under the existing code, minimum tree density was if you have your single-family home and you need to save 5 trees, they could all be the 2-inch caliper, or significant trees. It didn't matter whether they were a 30-inch caliper Doug fir versus a small tree. So the coverage goals really replace that, so that there is more weight given to, you have a percentage of the canopy coverage that you have to maintain. So it encourages larger, bigger trees that have larger canopy to be preserved. And then tree retention requirements for single family are increased. We've clarified the tree replacement requirements. We have on our existing code a tree removal form that, that created so much more confusion than what it solved, because is it a permit, is it a form? So it's all, you just apply for a tree permit. And then we had an administrative adjustment of standards with a pretty vague criteria, and what we heard loud and clear was most people applied for that and we got money in lieu of trees, so we've eliminated the administrative adjustment of standards. However, in order to give due process, there is a variance criteria, but it is a public process. And some of the comments we heard was tracking of tree removal. You heard earlier some comments related to that, that's important. Some sort of reporting for replacement trees is important. Then I think there were some concerns about exemptions for city right-of-way. And then concerns for that single-family property owners would now be able to pay fee in lieu of, as opposed to planting trees back on their property. And then also that the fee in lieu should account for maintenance and loss of benefits. There was some concern that, the 30-year target, there is not an accountability for short-term loss. So, which unfortunately with tree removal, there is a short-term loss, and that's hard to account for. Heritage tree program that has been, there was a discussion at Planning and Policy Commission whether that should be codified, and there was unanimous agreement that that should be in the code. A little bit description of how this canopy coverage goals are applied per lot. So, the city park department led this tree canopy study, which became a baseline for some of this discussion. So, for instance, in central Issaquah, the tree canopy coverage is 27%. It also identified, this study, that there's a possible planting area of 15%. And so we looked at that and said what should be, on a parcel by parcel basis, a requirement for canopy coverage goals. So we came up with a 35%. So this is where we're going to do some more testing of the code to see if it's achievable, it is the right percentage or not. And then we take another example, say Issaquah Highlands. Existing tree canopy is 27, possible planting area 20%, and the per parcel basis would be 45%. So we understand that this could be problematic for a 5,000 square foot lot. They're not going to meet 45% canopy coverage. So the unintended consequence of this would be, if there is a problem tree that's growing into the foundations and it needs to come out, we would grant them a permit. We would capture what the 45% canopy coverage goal needs to be, and then they would pay a fee in lieu of, where we would have a triage of this tree needs to be planted within the sub-area, and if it can't be planted within that sub-area, it can be planted off-site. So plant on-site if possible, within the sub-area, and then outside of the sub-area. And then there are some other, neighborhoods like Squawk Mountain has 63% tree canopy coverage. There's planting areas of 17%, but because of some of the fringe areas and the desire to be forward-thinking that there could be potential loss of trees for wildfire protection when you're right at the edge of the urban fringe. So we've picked a 45%, but there's no hard set and rule for these percentages. So we are going to continue to work and test these percentages. We intend to talk back with the folks that helped, the firm that helped us do the tree canopy, and see what that means. Understanding that replacement off-site is tricky, especially for privately held land. So your possible planting areas could include some privately held land. So it's hard to say that all of that can be replanted, because it may not. So, but the guiding principle in all of this has been, how do we achieve the 55% aspirational goal that was set up with the Climate Action Plan? So that's this. Again, tree canopy coverage, we'll continue to refine it to see if we want to have the sub-area approach and then have a more fine-grained approach for, residential and commercial distinction. So we intend to do these edits in the next round. We are going to implement the tree removal and replacement, and how do we track it? So obviously we can, track it through permit requirements, but there are going to be some trees that get removed and, that are hazardous, or snow event or something. It won't be a full accounting, but at least for the ones that get a tree permit, we could have a system. And the reporting for replacement trees. So we're thinking about what that could mean. It could mean, if you replanted a tree, you have to take a picture, and for the next 2 growing seasons, you upload it to make sure it's still healthy and staying, without making it undue hardship for someone to, go through that process. But we'll continue to fine-tune that. Fee in lieu of, some more clarification needed there. More work and analysis on the tree canopy coverage targets that I just went over, and then, of course, codifying the heritage tree program. That's the tree chapter.
Councilmember Ray?
Couple of things. I know that you said that you were determining the fee for in lieu of is something you're looking at. And then use the very ambiguous word appropriate. How do you determine what's an appropriate fee for a tree?
Yeah, we're going to be working with a consultant to kind of figure out, because it's the cost of the tree, it's the planting labor and materials, and then the maintenance of it. So it should account for all of those. So that is something we intend to come up with a number so that we can adopt it in a fee resolution, so we don't have to figure out what that fee amount is going to be.
And so kind of on the same vein, one of the things that you talked about was if I take a tree down over here, I may replant a tree someplace else, starting with the same parcel, same sub area, somewhere else in the city. How do we determine where best to put the replacement tree, and how do our canopy targets play into the determination of where that tree should go? Because my thinking is not all trees are created equal, and not all places need the tree as badly as the place you just cut it down. So how do we strike that balance?
Good question. Obviously with the climate action plan, the idea is the urban island effect, heat effect. So that's why putting it where it can grow. But if it was a wrong tree planted in the wrong place, then no point in kind of repeating that mistake again. But perhaps a smaller tree could go in that same spot. But if that doesn't work, then having a more robust tree fee in lieu of program that is managed well. I mean, right now I think Parks Department does a great job with the Green Issaquah program and the planting and all that occurs on city-owned lands. I mean, that's all what the city would be able to regulate in terms of the replacement trees. But there's no perfect answer for where the replacement trees are going to go. And if we can identify, in the sub area, some replacement sites that are publicly held, perhaps that's one way to handle it. Privately held in the same sub area are going to be difficult to manage, and make sure that the trees get planted, but they stay for the long haul. For the next 30 years, that tree is a replacement tree, and it stays.
Do you envision that the fee in lieu of would be based on the size of the canopy, or the size of the tree, or is it a sliding scale? Is it a fixed scale? How do you envision that?
Yeah, so the fee in lieu of would be per tree, but the canopy will determine, your canopy coverage will determine how many replacement trees you need. So if you cut down a really large canopy tree, that will mean more trees need to be planted. Therefore, the fee in lieu of will be that many trees times the fee per tree.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep.
Council President Moore.
Thank you. So a few questions. So do we have a sense of how other communities handle their tree canopy requirements and code? It seems like this concept of creating neighborhood level or sub-area level goals is something new. So I'm trying to understand if that's completely something that developers aren't going to be used to and other cities haven't done, or if that's kind of a standard idea. How far out ahead of the idea are we on this?
Yeah, when we were researching, Mount Lake Terrace is the other city that has this canopy coverage methodology. So there are fewer cities, but I think a lot more cities are realizing the more robust tree regulations. So I think most folks are used to just counting the number of trees, and it's easy, they can count, but it doesn't distinguish a better quality tree from a crappy tree. So I think in terms of figuring out the canopy coverage for the next 30 years, we'll have to kind of come up with some during the implementation of, this type of a tree means this percentage canopy coverage in the next 30 years. So there'll be some tools that we can develop during implementation that should help. But it is more complex than just counting the number of trees.
Toward that idea, one of the concepts was, you have to either measure the radius of the tree and then go out a certain number of feet, or you measure what the canopy of the tree is, or another alternative is to actually do a radar, LiDAR from the air. So I'm trying to understand how feasible that is, whether we understand what the costs are to developers for that. How feasible is it going to be for us with our staff to be able to say definitively, this is what your tree canopy coverage was, and this is what you're moving to? What are going to be the difficulties in that scenario?
Yeah, I think Daniel is here on the line, and so do you want to speak to the difficulties that we may encounter, Daniel?
Sure. Hi. Yeah, so we are, for development projects, we would be requiring arborist recommendations, which is something that we already do now. Part of the arborist recommendations moving forward will include for them to do that assessment. When it comes to smaller scale projects, or just a standard tree removal permit, staff will be able to do that. Part of that is going to be looking for programs to assist staff. There's one, the company that performed the tree canopy analysis, Planet Geo, they have a program that we currently have access to. It's called Tree Plotter, and that will allow staff to make those measurements.
Okay, and then my kind of final question is around the fee in lieu. So I know many cities have problems with this concept of paying a fee in lieu, and then all we end up with is fewer trees and lower tree canopy. So do we have a best practice example of an area that has done this well, or a goal that we're trying to go after as far as a best practice for finding a way to make this work?
I'm sorry, is that question for me or for Minnie? Either?
Probably for Director Dhaliwal.
Yeah, obviously, I think the goal is to preserve the canopy. Is it easy to do this? Not sure. It can be easy, but it's in practice, it never is. There are going to be loss in canopy for a variety of reasons. Weather related, wildfire is a big concern. There may be some thinning needed related to that, or just general, disease and decay of some of those trees that happens. What the codes can do is prevent a clear cutting. So what the codes can really help is you can't just go in and clear cut the whole site and do your development. So those things the codes are really good at. Now, every individual homeowner that has a problem tree obviously is going to get removed. The replacement is going to depend on educational aspects. I think in general, community members desire and like Issaquah for its greenery. So I think there's that desire to have that. So it'll have to be coupled by not just the codes, but also the great green, the Green Issaquah program that the parks runs, and other things that will keep up the canopy. So it's going to take more than the codes, if that helps.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are ready to proceed.
Okay. So the next, the last chapter is landscape. So this is more of a technical pieces, what type of trees, what size of trees, what type of soil amendments are needed, what square footage of landscaping do you need when you're doing your development. That's what this chapter deals with. As you can see, right now we have scattered standards in 4 different locations, so it'll consolidate it into one place. The goal is also to retain neighborhood charm and ensure sustainability through landscape standards. Some of the key changes, we've tried to have sustainability integrated with the irrigation, plant diversity, native drought-tolerant plant selection. We've updated the standards for irrigation. We have required a minimum planting width of 5 feet or minimum soil quantities, because one of the things that happens is the wrong tree at the wrong place and you get the sidewalks buckling up and high edges. Then there was some discussion about fences. I think we'll look at that to see the relationship of where we put the fence to where the landscaping is. The parking lot landscaping was consolidated. I think we heard some questions about, we have some screening requirements that probably are a little outdated, so we'll take a look at that. So here's the list of things we intend to incorporate with the next draft. Perimeter landscaping and parking lot landscaping. This is pretty standard for a lot of cities to have these, required landscaping areas. Developers know what they need to do. They can meet these requirements. There's not back and forth on it. So if you care to get some green space, it's good to say X amount and you can get that. The drawback of this is sometimes, flexibility is good. It's better to have a row of trees that's existing be preserved rather than put a small 6x6 island in a parking lot. But we'll look at that so that we can, ensure predictability, but yet provide some flexibility. There's a chapter, natural context requirements. This came from public comments. That's currently in the Central Issaquah Urban Design section, so we'll bring that forward into this chapter. And one of the environmental board members, had good comments on the tree list, that there are some inaccuracies there, so we will update that. We'll reach out to people within your boards and commissions that have that expertise and hopefully can fine-tune that list. And then also some connection between landscaping and stormwater. There was some desire to have rain gardens and gray water usage, so it's a little weak in that area, so we'll look into that. Then there was some comments about re-landscaping, how can we make it less onerous? So even if you're not doing redevelopment, but if you want to upgrade your landscaping and you have to go through this a lot of hoops in the permitting process, then perhaps there isn't an incentive for folks to upgrade it. So we'll look at that in the procedures section. Again, some more flexibility with the idea that to meet the golden outcomes for this update. And then, of course, consistency and organization, we'll look at that. So that pretty much concludes that chapter. The next steps are going to be PPC hearing on a consolidated draft with council review later, and we intend to come back to you all in June with zoning and uses section. That concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Director Dhaliwal. Sorry about that. Do we have any questions on this last section? And I don't see any questions from Council President Walsh on this section. Oh, now she does. Okay. Go ahead, Council President Walsh.
Thank you. I just had some questions about irrigation. There were some comments in the environmental board and some of the meetings. Can you explain what the approach is for irrigation and what some of those questions are that we might be looking to resolve in a second draft.
Yeah, so I think because of hot summer and climate change, there was we put some language in the code to say, browning of your lawns is okay. And so if you have an existing landscaping, you're not going to get code enforcement concerns during the summer months to let your, grass go brown. However, I think where we ended up with the conversation with the boards and commissions was if you're building in a new development and you're putting in landscaping, that we do require irrigation to be put in place. So there is not enough, you have more drought tolerant species and you have more plant diversity and all of those things, but you still have to irrigate it because otherwise those plants, the new plants that are going to be planted aren't going to make it. We'll look at, I think we had heard previously about drip irrigation versus the standard irrigation requirements. I'm not a big fan of putting too much technology into code because things can change. And, there may be a more innovative way of irrigation that comes along and we have a hardwired thing in the code. But it just leaves that you have to be a licensed landscape architect to produce your plans, and then you produce your irrigation drawings with it. If you have irrigation in a required public frontage, so along a street trees and things, there we have a requirement for what you need to meet. Obviously, some of those focus of those things are, in backflow devices, so you're not contaminating drinking water supplies and those kind of things. But so irrigation under this draft is required for new landscaped areas. But the gray water usage discussion occurred. I think a lot of area is in the critical area aquifer recharge. So there are concerns about, again, having development over your drinking water supply, and using gray water is a concern. But to the extent you can, store rainwater and use it for irrigation, those kind of mechanisms we can look into with the next draft.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had one question on this last section. There is some wording in here about, for example, just not disturbing the native soil to the extent practicable. And I wondered how we determine if it is to the extent practicable.
We know, we will have to fix that. I think the developers will say, well, it's not possible, and then we will have a debate, and nobody wins in that debate. And so we really want to have more predictability for what that means. Some of the comments that came in were, I think the code says if you disturb it, you store it on site and reuse it. I think the comments we heard from some were it's really not practical to kind of store it on site because you have, active construction site going on. You can't really do that. So I think it's a nice thing to require. I think the intent is because of stormwater and other reasons. There should be an attempt, but we'll have to, we either require it or we say, we don't require it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You saw where I was going with that.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions at this time? Okay, no other questions. So at this time, let me just check. I think we're good. At this time, we will then have public comments on this item. And so there is no one in the audience presently, so I will ask City Clerk if there is anyone on the call that is indicating a desire to speak on this item.
Yes, Councilmember Hunt. Connie Marsh has her virtual hand raised. Ms. Marsh, I'm making you a panelist. You should now see the option to unmute, and you may also turn on your video.
There we go. I'm sending my video. Okay. Yes, I am sunburned because I'm down in San Francisco setting fence posts. Woohoo! Anyway, I'm Connie Marsh and I typically am on Squawk Mountain. Many comments, many addressed. So I'm gonna go with, we'll start with trees first, which is the tree canopy is a very simplistic mechanism for the functions of trees. So, right tree in the right place, and what does it do, and how do you actually get people to do that, right? And so then that moves you over to the landscape code, which it's unclear to me so far who the authority is that the city will be using to make sure that you get the right tree in the right place, and whether they are going to have to replace the other functions besides pure canopy that trees provide. So in the PPC meeting that had new information where the community was not allowed to speak, one of the new bits of information was, well, these commercial areas like Central Issaquah and the Highlands, it's going to be hard to get the trees in. But if you look at the maps that show where the heat sinks are, those are exactly where the heat sinks are that we're trying to mend. So I think we need to remember, what actually are we trying to do? What problem are we trying to solve with these codes? And I think one of my frustrations is we're deep in the code, but we don't seem to go back to, we don't seem to go back to what problems are we trying to solve, and is this going to do that? And for example, if we reduce the tree canopy in Issaquah Highlands, that will not solve that heat sink problem. We have plenty of area up in the Issaquah Highlands. It's actually public area that we've tried to replant for many, many years. But the people come down and they cut down all of the new plantings, or they take them out because they don't want their views changed. I don't know. But those tree plantings have never succeeded. And that is the reality of life. So then you go to code enforcement, which is a little later on. So after you weave all of these things together, are you going to solve your problem? So I guess I'm asking you to think about it, not as much in the gears as it's being presented, but lift up to 30,000 feet and say, wow, what is our problem with trees that we want to solve? We need shade, right? Which is sort of canopy. We need stormwater. Yes, we also need habitat, and we need wildlife corridors. And we never talk, except for in a very small area in the introduction of the tree code, it talks about these functions, but then it never loops back to say how what we're doing is getting us those things. Okay, so that is a little bit on trees as it sort of bounces back and forth. If you talk about landscaping, what I do is I drive around Issaquah and I say, what's good and what's terrible landscaping? And does this landscape code actually get us something better? And what I see in Central Issaquah and many other parts of town is a bunch of scraggly lines of trees that actually prevent people from being able to walk through. And so I don't know why we have these little scraggly lines of trees and we aren't getting rid of them in this code. So what actually is our landscaping for in our varying areas? How much screening do we need? And I think if you guys could provide some of what your point of view is on this topic, it would be helpful to get something better for our town. And then when we go back to what was our first, okay, so the Parks Department situation, that I sent you. I actually spent a lot of my vacation time here looking up the park's strategic plan so that you could get more of the comprehensive plan language of what we are aiming for in our parks. And so when you look at what is provided to you, there's a lot of confusion about what is the green necklace as compared to what is sort of the citywide parks system. And I think that needs to be clarified entirely so that then we can understand whether we want to only focus on the green necklace, and my answer would be no. We need all of this to be citywide because we actually want our park linkages and connectivity citywide. And the map that you are seeing is a city-wide map. It's not a green necklace map. So I know that Minnie made some comments about.
Ms. Marsh, I'm sorry to interrupt. You're running over time. Can you please?
Yeah. Okay. I'm almost. Did you tell me I only had 5 minutes?
That's typical for public comment, 5 minutes, and you're a little over.
I didn't know this is a new committee, so I wasn't sure what my limits are with all of this. So good to know. And that was my consideration, is for looking at the definitions of the parks and getting them concrete so people actually can look at this and know what you're talking about, because at this point in time, they don't. Thanks.
Thank you, Connie. Is anybody else indicating a desire to give comments at this time?
Councilmember Hunt, I do not see any other raised virtual hands.
Okay, great, thank you. Then at this time, and seeing as there's no one in the audience to give comments, we will move into committee discussion and committee recommendation. And who would like to start us off?
I'd be happy to start us off.
Councilmember Ray.
Do you want to take them one at a time, or you want to take them all? How would you like them?
I think these are, separate and enough that we could do them one at a time and then make a recommendation at the end. But let's see, I see Council President Walsh is also nodding, so let's do it that way.
One at a time. So on the community spaces, I really don't have much to say about that. I think it is, I liked us implementing our current policies in a more consistent way. I think that's important. I would like to see, as we go forward, some of the questions around what are our neighboring communities doing around public spaces or community spaces, and how are they addressing it, and then going forward beyond that, even maybe coming up with some common parlance, some common language about what we call things, so that we align with other communities. So, but all in all, I thought that was a good, very nice job.
Thank you, Councilmember Ray. Council President Walsh, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree that we should come up with a common parlance and see what other communities are doing. I would propose at the very least calling it outdoor and indoor amenity areas. Generally, though, my feel is that private space should be decided by the market as an individual unit differentiator, and shouldn't be a requirement in code, the exception being retirement communities and other communal living situations. I also don't know if we want to essentially encourage rooftop decks. Personally, I have one and it's been a nightmare, and I wouldn't wish it on many people, but that's just my personal situation. Generally, I think we want to be looking for more community space, and especially if the market in its current situation with the requirements is giving us community space and also kind of balconies and other private spaces. I don't want to move toward a situation where people can kind of split the difference. I don't think that would give us what we're looking up in general. And then I really like the way the information was provided about the connection and orientation to open space and the use of the map. I just want to make sure that that is really solid and a really usable situation when we're looking down at the parcel specific area. So those are my thoughts.
All right, thank you. So firstly, I wanted to say thank you for laying out all of the comments that we've received in the matrix. I think that continues to be a helpful way to show the changes that are being made in response to all of the public comments that we continue to receive and all of the commission's input and all of the public meetings. And I firstly wanted to recognize you and your staff for putting that all together. On the community spaces piece, one of the things that I think this code should do is make sure to make, and it says in there somewhere, make people feel welcome. You should feel like you are correct to be there and that you're welcome in these communal spaces. And so I think when the intent for those spaces is to be a public space, a plaza, for example, one of the things that I've noticed in, for example, Seattle is they have a consistent signing that's prominent and it says that this is a public place and you can be here. I think that is important because yes, there are design elements that you can use to make it be more or less inviting, and definitely that the requirements of having the more oriented towards the public spaces, et cetera, should help, but I think signage is also important and is a very clear, and especially if it's done in a clear, consistent way, that can be a really useful tool. So I would encourage us to look at that, and I do think some neighboring cities, I've definitely seen it in Seattle, have this sort of signage that I think we could require. On the green necklace, it is great to see more definition of this, definition on this, and I think having the GIS layer so people actually know where these connections need to be will help it come to life, which will be great. I wonder about just making sure that it again is signed and is that information becomes available to people, because part of it is, the connections that we want to make between our parks and our community spaces and have those connections be used. So I would encourage us also to make sure that it's clear to the user that you can walk, by this building to get to another connection, et cetera, because I think that will be a challenge, but if it can be done well and people feel welcome along this green necklace, that would be wonderful. And then my last comment is on the amenities, citywide versus the Central Issaquah, Highlands, and Talus. I think unless we have a reason for sticking to those restrictions that isn't that our previous code did it that way, I think one of our goals with this overhaul, one of the goals of this improvement to our code is to standardize, and I think having a B citywide is more standard. You don't have to wonder if you're on one side of a boundary or the other, and so I think that it wasn't done citywide in the past isn't, for me, a good reason to do it that way. So I would revisit that. If there are exceptions, like you said, intensive commercial, maybe it doesn't make a ton of sense for intensive commercial. I'm not sure. I think actually maybe it does in some cases, but in any event, if there are exceptions because of a reason, then I think that could be laid out. But I think citywide, when it can be done, when the code can be applied citywide, I think that's more standard, so we should go with that. Those are my comments on the community spaces. So unless we have any other comments on this one, I will go next to the trees. And does anybody like to start us off on the trees part of the code update?
I'm happy to start trees, but I would also give Council President the opportunity to start this one if she was so inclined.
Councilmember Ray, I think you have the floor.
All right. So this is a hard topic. This is probably one of the most emotionally charged topics that we get to deal with. And, you know, trees fall down, trees need to be removed, trees become a danger, and you know, in developed land, we have to take down trees sometimes. And so with all of these circumstances, it's really a huge balancing act of how do you balance the need to take down trees with maintaining our tree canopy. And I really appreciate the, you know, maintaining the tree canopy as defined by the Issaquah Climate Action Plan and driving tree retention. And as Connie Marsh was talking about, saving hotspots in various parts of the city, I think that's really important. But trees are more than that to an awful lot of people who live here. I mean, trees are part of the aesthetic of neighborhoods. And so some of my kind of visceral reaction is a 10-inch tree is not equal to 5 2-inch trees. You know, they're just not the same. And so we have to balance that. And replacing a tree in an open space that's owned by the city when I take it down in a neighborhood isn't the same, because the people who are missing that tree from their neighborhood are never going to see it that's in the open space. So how do we balance that? And then, you know, the other problem is if I take a tree down over here because of whatever reason, how do I plant the right tree wherever that might be so it will thrive and fill the void? So I don't know that I have a lot of answers, but I have a lot of questions for this one, because I think, like I said, this is probably one of the most emotionally charged issues for this community is, why did you cut down my tree? And I got to tell you, when I don't know how long I've been on council, but I'm going to sound like Tola Martz here in a second, talking about way back when. But we had a thing in Talis called, and it was lovingly called Treemageddon, because people started coming out and started cutting down trees, and the neighborhood just lost their mind. And I mean, they really did. It's almost like someone, you know, like hung on to a true tree hugger so that they wouldn't cut down any more trees. So it's super important, and I'm excited that we're taking it on, and I'm really anxious to see how you solve all of my problems. Thanks, Minnie.
Thank you, Councilmember Ray. One thing I think towards the end, we're going to be trying to create a recommendation, which will be things for PPC and our commissions to revisit that we feel need to be revisited. So if you can formulate that into something to be revisited, then that would be great. And we'll try to wrap it up at the end with all of our recommendations. So Council President Walsh, did you have any comments on the trees? Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just find this really confusing to have neighborhood level or sub-area level goals apply at the parcel level as a requirement. You know, as somebody who lives in the Highland on a 5,000 square foot lot, I'm just trying to imagine what would happen if I'm sitting here going, okay, I've got maybe a nuisance tree that has to get cut down, and I've got a whole of 3 trees on my lot that's not going to get anywhere close to the percentage requirement, and kind of what that means for me as a community member. So I'm just having a really hard time understanding how this would apply. And I think what I would like to see is some examples from different areas, picking some parcels and trying to understand both from a single family residence and a multifamily residence, particularly when we're looking at redevelopment or just the loss of a single tree and what that's going to mean for those homeowners or developers if they're doing redevelopment. Because with the code as it is written, I'm just having a really hard time understanding what this is actually going to look at like, what it's going to look like from not only a requirement of either, you know, if I can't put the trees on my lot, how am I going to find someplace else? What is the fee in lieu? How am I going to navigate that? What kind of expertise am I going to get at? And then the other piece for me is, how does that differ from other local communities? If this is so much more stringent and it gets us what we want, I can understand, but I'm not entirely clear whether the sub-area requirements and kind of based on the goals that chart, whether that has a sense of achieving what we want, or whether the numbers were kind of just pulled out. Yeah, so I have a hard time understanding how this will be applicable and whether it's going to get us what we want. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Council President Walsh. And as I mentioned earlier, I think at the end we'll try to create a list of topics. So it sounds like that could also be one of them. And then I will give my comments on the trees. So I think there's a lot of improvements here. The removal of the tree form, which caused confusion, and replacing that with a permit process that involving an arborist and involving the need for expert opinion is also, I think, a positive development. I am mostly concerned about two things. One, the potential for just the removal of trees over time and the gradual removal of trees, going from 35% to, then you remove a bunch of trees and get to that, and that now you have a smaller percentage and continuing to remove trees. I know that can be an issue on certain properties as they remove a couple trees at a time and then they want to remove more. So I think that the issue there is monitoring, because I don't think the code really allows that, but then you get into how are we tracking and how are we actually monitoring over time. So that would be something that I think we could make sure that we are equipped to enforce what we have on the books, and to enforce it, I think we need to have some monitoring there. So that would be good to know. It does occur to me that this may be a conversation also about resourcing, which isn't in code, but staffing resources, which would then be part of our conversation when we get to budget. So if that's the way that we need to address monitoring, then it may not be in code, but I would still like to know what the plan is for that. And then on the tree canopy per parcel, there is a pretty significant decrease in what's currently the canopy cover of squawk versus what would be allowed on the parcel. And I think that was true of some other areas as well. I think if we are talking about fire breaks, I think it would be good to get an expert opinion about whether that particular percentage can be justified by fire breaks. My understanding is there's a certain area around the house, but potentially if you have a much larger area, a lot of that area could already be farther away from your house. If you have a smaller lot, then maybe it is requiring a larger percentage of the lot to be a fire break. In either case, I think maybe if that's the goal, we should have code about that, not justifying a certain percentage of the canopy due to the fact that you need a fire break around the house. And I sort of similarly to Council President Walsh, just wondered, it seems there was a lot of judgment that went into getting those percentages based on what was there and what was plantable. And if we go that route with all of these differentiators, really making sure that we do achieve our end goal, which is in our climate action plan, which is 55%. I think with all of those combinations, I'm not sure that gets us there, but I would want to make sure that we are accounting for our existing goal, which is overall 55%, and then making sure that within each neighborhood they are also retaining their tree forested character. I think that those are my comments on the trees. There was also a conversation about screening, and you had mentioned, Director Dhaliwal, that were you planning on revisiting the screening, the parking lots, trees, or that was something that?
Yeah, I think that was in the landscape chapter. We have some, you can screen by wall, it was more of a parking lot screening. So yeah, we will look at that.
Okay, great, thank you. So those are my comments on trees. I think there's a lot to like here. Then the last section is landscape, and who would like to start us off on landscape comments?
I really don't have any comments on landscape, so I'll let President Walsh go first on this one.
All right, Council President Walsh.
Okay, I've got a few. I really don't understand why there's a difference in the landscape requirements, especially around the parking and stuff like that, where we have one standard for central Issaquah, Issaquah Highland, and Tallis versus the remainder of the city. I really tried to understand what the differences proposed were for each of them, and they looked awfully similar for me. So I'd love to get a sense of why we decided we needed two standards there. I really would like to consolidate if possible. And then going beyond that, I really want to stress, I want to find some way to handle the idea of irrigation and gray water and native plants that don't require as much watering or irrigation. Just some sense of a better way to do that. And I was looking at Redmond's new code that they adopted in February. And I really like the ecological score requirement section that they have, which provides a table of options. It says like, if you use this amount of native plants or you keep this amount of native soil on site, you use gray water or green roofs or anything like that. I think that ultimately gets us toward our goal in a better way. It also addresses things like having conifer trees and, all of the things that we want, but which may not be applicable or best achievable on any individual lot. So it allows for customization in a table that's really clear and easy to understand. Similarly, they also have a really nice section on irrigation where they say it's required for greater than 500 square feet with an automatic system designed to conserve water and a rain sensor device. I think while not having certain sets of technology required in code, we can still think about what are the goals? Well, I only want irrigation required if it's large enough that it's going to need it, if it's non-native plantings that are going to need it, and if we're gonna do irrigation, I want it somehow to conserve water and have a rain sensor so that it's not adding water usage at times when aren't needed. So I'd just like to kind of take a step back and really make sure that with the landscaping, we're achieving what we want to there. That being said, I do really appreciate looking at the allowed and preferred or whatever the list of trees was and letting one of the commission members help with that. I think that will help us get where we want. I had something else I was thinking about that I didn't write down and I cannot remember. Okay, well, it's gone now, but thank you.
All right, thank you. So I had a few comments. One is, and I made this comment earlier about the wording extent practicable, just to make sure that we have, if we're requiring it, it's required, and make sure that that wording is not there. The other thing, I believe that, there's references to turf throughout this section, and I believe that artificial turf would also be governed by this section. Is that correct? It isn't, there's nothing specific to it, but since it's turf, and I believe it would be here if it were.
Yeah, we probably should look at that, and, the issue with the school district that came up, so we'll look at that. Yep.
Yes. So that would be my request is to look into, specifically, there's some tire material that is used in artificial turf, and to make sure that we are using our best available science about that and its implications for, because there's some potential implications for that, for ecological functioning, and specifically salmon and fish. And so just to make sure that we have used this opportunity to update this section regarding artificial turf materials. And the city on our own fields uses a different material already to address this, so that would be an opportunity to make sure that any future application of that would be using that same standard. And then other than that, the comments about, so there is a lot of landscaping requirements for parking lots, and screening and where it's tree. I think the diagrams help, but it's still not totally clear to me what those are trying to achieve. So maybe more visuals about what we want to use the landscaping for would be helpful. I guess that section, it was clear how to comply with the code, but I think it wasn't completely clear what the goal was to me. So those are my comments on the landscaping section. Again, thank you for all of the work that went into addressing the comments from the commissions. I think that was very helpful. All right, so now at this point, we are tasked with clarifying if there are any things that we would like the commissions to revisit before, in the next steps of this process. And other than that, make a recommendation for this to continue in the process. Is that fair? Okay. So I've taken some notes, and I will try to formulate some recommendations here, although if I miss anything or if we want something restated, let me know. So the first one was community spaces. We had comments on a number of things, but I think the only thing that we wanted revisiting were the citywide application of the code and then signage. Is that, Councilmember Walsh, did you have anything that you would like revisited? I know I have down focus on the public spaces, but I'm not sure if that's something you would like them to revisit or.
I'm not sure whether it's a PPC revisit or staff revisit and bring back to us, but the sense of these amenity spaces versus community spaces, what the standard is for other neighboring communities, and then also any naming norms that we might look at.
Okay, so maybe we can categorize things into requests for things that we believe need to be revisited, and then information requests that we just want more information on. Okay, so would those be information requests then under that framing?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, great. Anything else for community spaces? All right, under trees, we have a lot of concern. So my thought on trees would be revisiting this, maybe an information request, but looking at some examples of what would be allowed under the code from a practical standpoint in the different neighborhoods, and that could help us, because a lot of our concern were about, does this keep the forested character that we want, and how would this be applied on a parcel that's X, size of X, and how would it work in one neighborhood versus another? So I'm wondering if we have some examples, if that would help. And then it wouldn't need to go back to PPC, just we need some examples to understand. Okay. Do we have anything within the tree category that that we believe needs to be revisited by PPC?
So I don't know if this is something that needs to be revisited, but when the council president was talking about, her personal example of replacing a tree, I think there's a difference between how to apply this to existing developed areas and new developed areas, because I think the standards are different. And one of the things that I'm struck with is, particularly in new development, the fee in lieu of trees creates an incentive to cut down trees because the fee is lower than the cost of maintaining the trees. And so if there's a way that we can drive the incentive out of this to cut down trees, particularly in new development, I would be all for that. So I don't know if that's a PPC question or if that's a staff question, but it's a question that I think we need to address in this, is how do we incentivize the right behavior? And right is always an ambiguous word, but the behavior that I think that our citizens want to see. So that's the only other thing I would have to add to what you had there, Councilmember Hunt.
Okay. Okay, so we do then want to look, maybe we would request that PPC look if the variance, because that's a variance, I believe, that you would need to go to the fee in lieu of. Is that correct?
No, the variance would be that you're not meeting your percentage, but you can't meet it, so the fee in lieu of you would comply with the code. If it's a healthy tree that you need to take out because that's the only way you can add your utility line or something like that, that would be a variance criteria for that. But if you can meet, if the code doesn't allow you to take out a healthy tree and you want to take one out, then you apply for a variance. If the code allows you, you can meet your square footage or percentage, but short of meeting it on site and you want to pay fee in lieu of, then you would go down that path. There's also tree retention requirements, I think what Councilmember Ray was talking about. So for new development, you have to have 35, so many percentage of your significant trees have to be preserved. And that's just a number, or a percentage number. It's not necessarily a canopy thing. Daniel, do you want to explain the tree retention requirements, which are separate from the tree removal and replacement?
Yeah, so the retention requirements apply largely to development or redevelopment. It's not something that you would do as a single family homeowner. So if you have a hypothetical 1 acre site that's completely forested and you want to develop it into single family tract development, you would be required to retain 35% of the existing caliber inches for the site. So it's not based on number of trees. We're not saying that you have to keep 35% of the trees. It's based on caliber inches. So there's an incentive there to keep the largest trees because they're going to help you meet that 35%.
And if I can't or I don't, what do I do, or do I have to?
You, as part of development or redevelopment, you have to. That's a requirement. I suppose that you could request a variance to go lower than that. Based on the way that the variance approval criteria is written, I don't know that you're going to get a yes.
So we've strengthened the code where you are required to save
Okay.
35%. It
'Cause-
used to be administrative adjustment of standards, and you could just apply for it, and it was granted, and you just paid fee in lieu of.
Okay.
So
and
that's
I-
gone away.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that's maybe what I'm looking for. Thank you, Minnie.
Okay. So I wonder though if we could still look at if there are other places where there's the application of in fee in lieu, if we can strengthen that and reduce the usage of that, because that is a concern.
If there are other opportunities to, kind of perform that same activity that makes sense, I mean, what I really want is for us to incent the right behavior and to disincent the wrong behavior. So what I just heard was really encouraging, because that's great. So if there are other areas where that kind of thought process can occur, then I say let's explore those.
Okay, great. So I think that's it for trees. The last one is the landscaping part of this landscaping chapter. And let's see, Council President Walsh, do you think did you have a specific question that you would like revisited by PPC from your comments?
Yes, I'd like to know why there's a difference in the landscape requirements and whether the parking lot requirements, and whether there's a reason we should continue that. Maybe that's a question for Director Dollywell first, before I say it's something that I want to see go back to PPC.
All right, Director Dollywell, could you please help us understand why there are differences in the parking lot landscaping requirements for the different neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how much of a difference it's going to make between those two, so we'll look for ways to standardize it. But the basic premise of it was you're going to have more urban development in these urban villages and in central Issaquah. That you don't have more of a suburban environment where you have larger, parking lots. I mean, with redevelopment, you're going to get structured parking and so on and so forth. So therefore, the delta difference between what a parking lot landscaping in these areas looks like versus the outside of these areas. But we can look for, if it's only not much of a difference, then we can standardize it. I mean, I think with this consolidation exercise, some of those nuances are coming out. We've had these different differences, but are they that different to remain different?
Okay. Council President Walsh, does that address your thoughts on that
Yeah,
one?
it sounds like that's something that can potentially happen at an administration level. And then my other big question was on irrigation. I feel like there's still a question whether irrigation should be required to be installed. And so I know the administration has said that they're going to take a look on the second draft about gray water and stormwater and rain gardens and all of that. Does that include irrigation, or is that a larger question that would have to go back to PPC for consideration?
I think what our thought process on that was that we would encourage, installation of rain gardens, or if you have a stormwater bioswale that can count towards some landscaping requirements. So encouraging some of those areas that encourage stormwater on-site infiltration. But again, we would need to coordinate with the stormwater, the work that's occurring with the stormwater plan to see if that's even feasible in the redevelopment areas, and if so, but at least in the landscaping chapter, we don't want to prevent folks from being able to have dual purpose. So if you have a space where you can treat your stormwater and you can plant those grasses that actually eliminate some of those contaminants, those kind of things. So we would make it more of a incentive for someone to double count. You can clean your stormwater and you can count towards your landscaping. So if there's opportunities like that, through rain garden or other opportunities, we want to encourage that. That's not in the code right now, so we would make it more of an incentive.
Okay, but what about irrigation? Was
Well,
the question.
yeah, the draft right now requires irrigation, and I think our recommendation is we shouldn't say you're not required to provide irrigation at this stage, without really understanding that you're not gonna have dead plants. I mean, summers are getting warmer, the first 2 planting seasons are gonna be tough, so you do need to have some irrigation for newly planted areas. But I think some of the other ideas you talked about, having water conservation, water sensors, and those kind of things, we can certainly look at that. Ecological score, option that you were talking about, we can certainly explore that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I know that also some of the HOAs, earlier in this process, we had heard comments about the need for maintaining irrigation, and that falls then upon the homeowners association once it's been installed, and that can be an ongoing issue. So I think just looking at if there are practical ways to keep the plants alive using drought tolerant plants, et cetera, then that would be great. It also takes the burden off of the people that have to maintain those plants. So okay. So from my standpoint, because it's a new topic and ultimately Planning Policy Commission will approve make a recommendation on the whole chapter, and I think that probably the artificial turf would probably need to go by Planning Policy Commission for their consideration, but it also needs to be researched by staff, and so that would be my request on the landscaping part. All right. Well, I think, do you have what you need from us, or, okay. Would you
Sure,
like us
just
to
one
specify?
quick clarification. So when we talked about information and going back to Planning and Policy Commission, so we're gonna take all of this, redo, and we intend to check in with the Planning Policy Commission with the consolidated draft, but we'll pull out these things that have changed and give them the analysis so they can weigh in. Is that sort of your understanding?
I think so, and then
Okay.
there were some specific things that I think we flagged that that weren't really addressed, like the ones that I raised, which come to mind because I raised
Sure.
them, but like signage, not
Yeah.
really addressed, and then this artificial turf one. So to call those out since they're new, and we would like to make sure that they go through the same process as everything else.
Will do. Yep.
Okay, so are we good? All right. So this is our first meeting in this format, and we can choose to make a formal recommendation, but on this item, since it's continuing work in progress, we can also, I think, continue and move along to the next item. All right. So then I think we're all in agreement that we can move on to our next and final item. So the last item on our agenda then is ID 1128, code enforcement changes, and this will be presented by Lori Dunning, our code enforcement officer. So welcome, Lori, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Lori Dunning. I'm the code enforcement officer for the city of Issaquah, and I thank the committee, Committee Chair Hunt. Nice to meet you. Council Member Ray and Council President Walsh. Thank you for your time tonight. Oh, that's a different slide. I guess we started with Minnie's presenting, but I'm actually presenting this tonight. So I'm going to run through our PowerPoint, and then City Attorney Anne Marie Soto is here to answer any legal questions that we have, because I think there's going to be a few. City Clerk, if you'd like to go to the next slide. Thank you. So our purpose tonight is we're proposing some code enforcement changes to fill up our toolbox. Current code enforcement provisions are outdated, contain conflicts across the municipal code. Changes are required to provide legally defensible enforcement procedures and are necessary for protecting neighborhoods, community assets, and the environment in general. Next slide. So we're seeking direction, feedback, and recommendation on adopting procedural amendments for several existing codes, including Title 18, to eliminate conflicts, and feedback and recommendation on adopting a separate code enforcement chapter under Title 8, entitled Health and Safety, which would be very appropriate, that establishes code enforcement process and procedures and related amendments throughout the IMC. Next slide. So our background is our current processes are confusing, unclear, they are undefined, and they're unclear for staff, citizens, and property owners alike. The current citation system, ticket system, does not require actual abatement or achieving compliance of code violations, only payments of fines, and then code violations and thus citizen requests go unresolved. So the pictures I've included are actual cases that I've been involved in another jurisdiction. So better codes give us better legal tools to achieve compliance. Next slide. So our proposal is to, code amendments across the IMC, several titles, to eliminate the conflicts, update outdated codes, some as old as 1984 that I think I've seen. Propose separate code enforcement chapter in Title 8, as we've said, to provide a civil notice of violation process rather than civil infraction or tickets. The new process uses a hearing examiner appeals process, which will require actual abatement and not just paying penalties that don't actually resolve the problem. The new process also includes the potential for financial penalties and liens against property titles as necessary to ensure ongoing compliance. Next slide. So Title 18 amendments, Resolution 2021-06 included factors to consider when placing any Title 18 changes on a separate track. And so is there any urgency or time sensitivity? What is the budgetary and or resource staff impact? Are there other planned work? Is there other planned work that would be delayed? What benefit, public or otherwise, would be gained? Or conversely, what is lost by not pulling the topic out separately? Are there trade-offs or potential conflicts with other parts of Title 18? And then any other considerations appearing relevant? Next slide. So by options, by having and continuing our same process, we don't have a very full toolbox. We have a very empty toolbox right now at city staff. So this is the same property. Again, a property I am very familiar with, and I did inspire and compel compliance with this property owner. That two-story addition of the house, actually that was built without permits at all. And obviously they have junk vehicles, they have trash, they have other stuff going on in the backyard. And the property, or the photo on the right, is actually the final result after 2 years of using our process, compelling compliance. I don't think we had to take it to Superior Court, but we did take it to different levels, and tickets would not have compelled this change. Tickets would have taken away the money that they put into permitting to come up with the final result. Next slide. So we're seeking recommendation and committee feedback to present code enforcement code amendments to the council for adoption and to provide staff with the tools to actually compel compliance. And again, it's an actual house that I worked with permits to see the final result in a very public street and jurisdiction I worked at previously. And this is our goal, is to comply or compel compliance and not actually just collect fees. I think that's the last slide. Is that the next slide, Chris? the timing of the next steps. So we're seeking regular council separate track Title 18 amendments on May 16th and June 21st for the code enforcement ordinance adoption. And that's the last slide.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. And we
Thank
will
you.
now take any questions for Lori, and I believe also we have Anne Marie if there are legal questions as well. So, hello, Councilmember Ray.
Great. Thank you, Lori, and love the photos. That made it very real. Can you talk a little bit of the difference about what's the difference between fines versus forcing compliance, and what that looks like in practical terms, and just to give me a little more understanding of kind of what you're hoping to accomplish?
Sure. That's a great question. So where I've worked in the past, and even here in Issaquah, I've seen where we've collected assessments or fines or tickets or penalties, whatever. And to be honest, collecting money from a property owner takes away the resources that they would have to, let's say, get a permit if they, did some illegal construction or did something that they're going to need some money to fix that. And I think Deputy City Attorney Soto and I are in the same agreement. We're in the same frame of mind that, yeah, we would rather have compliance and ongoing, permanent compliance. Get a permit for your land altering project, for your construction, to make sure life safety and environmental assets are protected. So just sending out a ticket or an invoice takes away the money that they could put towards compliance.
Oh, I think that's great. Can you talk a little bit about what?
I want to make sure that we recognize, because I see Anne Marie is raising her physical hand. So Anne Marie.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not always used to the WebEx version, so I was like, I don't know where the hand raise is. So I just wanted to provide a little bit more information about the fines versus the notice of civil violation process that staff is recommending. So what the city currently has for violations of the municipal code, they're either deemed civil infractions that are enforced by issuing a ticket that can then be appealed to the municipal court. The municipal court has the ability to require the person to pay the ticket, or they can reduce the amount of money that the person has to pay, but they don't have the authority to actually compel compliance. You could issue a ticket every single day, and that might compel compliance because the person gets tired of getting, a ticket every single day. But ultimately, that's not a process that leads to someone who can actually say, you must do X, Y, Z by this date. You also have in your current code that some violations of the code are crimes. They're designated as either misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors. And as I'm sure you all know, that is a criminal process that goes through a completely different set of procedures than civil violations. What we don't have are just normal civil violations that are not handled through the issuance of a ticket. That is the process that we're recommending. This is a process that's pretty common in a lot of jurisdictions. Lori and I actually worked together in another jurisdiction where we adopted a very similar process, and it was something that actually worked for that jurisdiction. And so this gives you the ability to issue a notice of violation that outlines the corrective action that is required, and it states that if you don't complete it by X date, then you might be assessed a fine. You get an opportunity to appeal. That appeal then would go to a hearing examiner. The hearing examiner has the ability to order compliance and to order payment of fines. Most of the time, as Lori mentioned, we're not seeking the payment of fines, we're seeking compliance. So there are provisions in this draft that would allow for reduction of fines or waiver of fines in certain circumstances, because really we're just trying to get compliance. And then ultimately, if you go through that whole process, and there's still no compliance, you still have the ability to go to Superior Court to get a warrant of abatement where a judge actually is telling the person you must do this corrective action by X date. And if you don't, then the city has the ability to go upon the property, correct the violation, and then assess the cost of that abatement against the property.
This is great, and you just answered my follow-up question, which is, what is the inducement then to compel compliance? So great. So I'm thank you for that.
Welcome.
All right, great. Council President Walsh, did you have any questions on this? Not seeing any. Okay, then I do not have any questions. So we will call for public comments on this item. I will check in with the city clerk. Is anybody on the line wishing to make comments on this item?
Councilmember Hunt, I see Connie Marsh's hand raised, but I'm not clear if it was from the previous agenda item or not. Ms. Marsh, can you illuminate us? Ms. Marsh? Councilmember Hunt, I believe that's a hand raised from the previous topic, and I see no other virtual hands raised at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. There being no public comments on this, then we will move to our committee recommendations. And I see we have some comments for comments from Council President Walsh. I also will remind the committee that on this one, we do have a recommendation that we can make. So I can go ahead and make that motion once we're ready, and we can make a formal recommendation on this one. Council President Walsh.
Excellent. Thanks. So I guess my comments on this are more on the presentation, if this then moves forward to general counsel, because I love the concept of, hey, we're taking something that through our hands-on experience we find doesn't work. We have experience in making a change to another method that does work. I mean, that is ultimately the perfect scenario. It's exactly what we want to see in a municipal government, is taking proactive action on something that isn't working to fix it. So I like the concept. I think what I would need to see in looking at this going forward is a better understanding what each of those title section changes, because what we got was kind of floating sections with basically redlining. But I had a really hard time understanding what each of those sections referred to and kind of whether the proposed financial or legal penalties were appropriate. I didn't have anything to compare it against. And in some cases, you were proposing changing the financial penalty downward. In other cases, you were eliminating it. And so I just think working us through that concept would be really helpful. So those are kind of my comments. Council Member Hunt, you said that we have a potential motion, which would be kind of an official recommendation of moving this forward. So trying to think how I place my comments in relationship to my thoughts on the recommendation. Should I wait?
Well, Council President Walsh, is your request for when this comes back a request that there be a version that is the clean, without the red line changes, a clean code version that you could read? No, that doesn't address.
No, I think it just needs more explanation, more context, providing like I'm trying to pull up the right pieces, but there were a lot of different title sections, and I understand that code enforcement applies to a lot of different areas of our code. So I just feel like, as somebody who's not as familiar with some of those concepts, I want to be handheld a little bit more, Lori. Just hold my hand, take me through it, and I think that would be really useful for the rest of council, because while I can see in concept that this is great, I'm ultimately, as a voting member, responsible for the specifics of it. And so I need to understand what the proposed changes are, why there was a change more or less, and whether that's similar to other communities or, I guess I'm just saying at some point we're going to have to look into the details. But I don't know if that's what this is, because what we're really looking at here is kind of is it just the question of, is this appropriate for a separate Title 8 track from Title 18?
Anne Marie, would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, so here, hopefully this can provide a little bit more context. So the Title 18 piece is because we are recommending some changes that impact Title 18 purely to fix the conflicts that are found within Title 1 and Title 18 right now, and Title 16. But if we wait to address those particular issues until the complete Title 18 update is done at the end of the year, we're going to be creating more conflicts if we adopt this new code enforcement chapter. With respect to your comments about the different changes to the violations, and why are some things the amount has gone up and some have gone down, we can provide a little bit more information about that to the council at the next meeting. I think that's a really good comment. Frankly, we did not get into every single one of those details because there are so many. So just for example, in the city's current code in chapter 1.36, there's a section of civil infractions, and it's a table that lists all of these different violations with a fine. Most of that is outdated. So there are things that are listed there as being civil infractions that state law provides are crimes. There are things in there that are listed as infractions with a penalty of, X number of dollars that is greater than the penalty that's allowed by state law for a civil infraction. There are penalties that are listed in there that are listed in this chapter 1.36 and then listed somewhere else in the code as having a different type of violation or a different penalty. And so what we're trying to do here is we're getting rid of that table in particular and having consistent penalties for anything that's a misdemeanor will have the same penalty provision. Anything that's a gross misdemeanor, same penalty provision. Anything that's an infraction, same penalty. Anything that's a civil violation, same penalty. And then we're recommending that basically every violation, every civil violation of the Issaquah Municipal Code would be treated as a civil violation through that would be addressed through a notice of civil violation rather than an infraction, unless it's specifically pointed out that it's an infraction. So it's only those things that are remaining in the code that say that they're an infraction that would be issued a ticket. And those are things where you might need, for example, a more immediate resolution. So, something like someone's having an event without a permit. You don't want to issue them a notice of violation and then you give them a time, you have to complete it by this date. You just want to give them a ticket. Or something like littering, where, those are things that are typically enforced by police. You don't want to have someone litter you actually see them littering, and then you have to go through a process of code enforcement going and writing a notice of violation and sending them a notice in the mail because they had littered. No, you want the police to be able to immediately write someone a ticket because they saw them littering. So we really were thoughtful as to the types of violations that should be addressed through, crimes versus infractions versus civil violations. We did discuss it with all of the other departments that are involved with code enforcement, including police, public works, parks, planning, fire. They all had an opportunity to weigh in on this to make sure that they were comfortable with the changes that were made. We did receive some comments, but for the most part, we didn't receive any feedback aside from a couple of minor details. So, I hope that provides a little bit more context. It is something where, for the next stage, we can include some more of that information that will help the council as a whole. But because there are so many changes that are being made, we didn't go line by line, in a PowerPoint explaining this change, is to this penalty because X, and then go through, every single violation in the code, because we would be covering pretty much every single title of the code then.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the explanations that you've given in this. That gives a lot more context and sense of, hey, this is the reason why, and here's what consolidation looks like, and here's kind of the before picture and the after picture, and here's the lines that draw us between the two. So that's really useful. Councilmember Hunt, I guess the question I would have for you is, are we focusing more on the proposed changes and adjustments that we would want to see to those changes, or as we would usually do for policy, or are we focusing more on, should this be a separate track from Title 18 and our feedback on what that process is?
Right. So my thought is that we can use this opportunity to do both. We can review the content and have that discussion, but we can also make the recommendation on the separate track. The recommended timing that's in our in the slide deck that was presented is May 16th regular council meeting, and then June 21st also regular council meeting. So, City Administrator Bobkowitz.
Yes, Councilmember Hunt, members of the committee. We're really looking for two separate actions here. The first is to deal with the Title 18 requirements that the council has, which is procedural, not substantive to the matter. The second is the substance of the matter. And so that we're here this evening asking the committee for its recommendation to move forward to the full council. So I think based on Council President Walsh's comments this evening, I think you have a couple of choices. You can have additional questions this evening, be satisfied with what you're seeing, but ask that the presentation to the council be done in a little bit different way, because one of the things we're going to be asking all the committees moving forward is, how would you like this presented to the council? Will this be a consent calendar item? Will this be a regular business item? And I think from Councilmember Walsh's comments, if we can get through at least the substance with the committee this evening, but the desire to have it more carefully described at council, then perhaps the recommendation is it comes back to council as requested, but on the regular business, and so that there's a presentation at that. So that, I think those are the two separate tracks, one being just the Title 18 and the second, the disposition of the actual matter.
Right, I think that aligns with what I was thinking. So the May 16th regular council meeting separate track, that would also need to be on an agenda, so that could be consent, but then the item for council would come back with additional information June 21st, and we could put it on regular business if that's the desire of the council. But
or ask that it be formatted in a different way and leave it on consent, but make sure that the written document is a little clearer. So okay, that's the flexibility I think now that we have returning to committees. It's really the committee's decision. Okay,
great. Thank you for that. So I will go ahead and make my comments. I think to me, it seemed straightforward. We have our city code enforcement officer saying we don't have the tools needed to enforce the code. Here we are making all these updates to Title 18 and improving our code, and we don't have the tools to enforce it, so we need to make a change. And then we also have our city attorney saying the same thing. So from my perspective, I think this is something that we should put on a separate track. It seems to meet the criteria of having a public benefit because we need to be able to enforce our code and give the city staff the tools they need to do that. So I think it meets those criteria, and I think it's also, there's one of the criteria about being able to be done separately, and in this case, I think there's an extra benefit for it being done separately, because if we can get this right and then we update all of Title 18, then we can then enforce those changes. So I think it makes a lot of sense to put it on a separate track. So I'll start there. I think maybe we can take these items one at a time. If we all agree on it being on a separate track, we can make a recommendation to do that first. So I'll go ahead and make a motion to recommend that that this item be put on a separate track of Title 18 amendments, and that this return on the consent calendar on May 16th.
Can I ask a question? I think I've got this, but I really do want to make sure before we do this. So the first question really is to bring to the council and seek the full council's approval to move forward with a separate track on Title 18.
That's correct. Under council policy,
Yeah.
the council would refuse to consider it without that exception being made.
Okay, so this is really the procedural step.
That's correct.
To get the council's okay to move forward with a separate Title 18 amendment. Great, thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay.
Try to do that again?
No, so I think I've made the motion. We don't actually need a second because we're only 3 people. So is there any discussion, thoughts on this? Or we can go ahead and vote on this particular part, and then we can move to the second part, which is the regular, the content that we would have recommendations on. All right, so all in favor of making that recommendation to put this on a separate track and have that be on consent, signify by saying aye.
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 Great. Okay, so the second part of this would be what actually we want to recommend on the substance that would go back to the council. And this could be an opportunity for Council President Walsh or my fellow Councilmember Ray, to make any suggestions. And I will say, from my perspective, I thought the pictures were great. It makes the point. I think the other thing that was very compelling is that the money that you could just be spending on fines could be used to actually do what we need the code to do and make the changes necessary to the property to bring it into compliance. So I think the narrative to me made a lot of sense. If we want to have more information about the specific changes, I think it would be good to clarify that, and we can make sure that staff have the information they need to make those changes. So I'll hand it back to Council President Walsh if you have specific changes that you'd recommend to presentation.
I guess I would just say maybe somebody go back into the meeting and listen to the description of process that Anne Marie had kind of listed out of, this is how it happens currently, this is the proposed, because I agree that the images and the assurance of, hey, I've done this before and this worked is great, but what's missing is how do we induce somebody to actually fix? Why did the fines not work and get us what we want? And what's the ultimate, if somebody doesn't do what we want, what's the potential ultimate inducement? So I think if we include those pieces, That's good. I think the other thing from my perspective, again, is anytime you're changing penalties, I just want to make sure that we are not way out of line with our neighboring cities and anything that's kind of a norm. And in particular, Anne Marie, as you said, any time we're in agreement with the state limitations, kind of delineating all of those pieces so that we know we're making a good decision. In some cases, we're eliminating $1,000 fine. In other cases, we've got something of potential imprisonment in jail for up to 364 days. So I think with that information, our fellow council members can make an effective decision.
All right. Councilmember Ray?
Yeah, I'm going to concur with Council President Walsh that the descriptions we heard tonight were from both Lori and from Anne Marie were great and added a lot to the conversation. And I think if we updated the presentation to include some of that information, I think that'd be great. What struck me is kind of an interesting thing about the committee structure is it's an opportunity for us to ask questions, which actually helps improve the quality of the presentation going forward to the full council. So that was my my just personal takeaway from this evening's conversation. And I think it's great that we are getting this in compliance or aligned with the reality, I guess. So I think there's a very compelling argument to move forward with this. So I'm pretty excited, and I think the 21st is great.
All right, great. So the last question would be if we think this should be on regular business, or if we believe that this could be on consent. And a reminder that any council member can pull any item off of consent. So that's always an option if somebody did want to pull the item off of consent. But I'll open it up to my fellow committee members if you have thoughts. Councilmember Ray.
I have several thoughts, and they conflict with each other. But I'm struck with that in many ways this is fairly straightforward and can go on consent. That being said, I think the explanation of why we're doing what we're doing is too complex. Would be better served in person and in a presentation. And so I guess my feeling is it should be on regular business so that we can actually get the presentation from Lori and from Anne Marie as we got it tonight, because I think that was super helpful.
All right, Councilmember Walsh, thoughts?
I'm also back and forth on this concept as we're moving from this committee structure, how much duplication we want to have at the council meeting versus putting something on consent. Part of it is how much do we need something to be surfaced and kind of presented. I don't think we're necessarily requesting changes to the content here, just clarification of how it is presented. I'm not sure I have a strong feeling. I think it's more about what we want to do from a practice going forward. Do you have any thoughts on that, Councilmember Hunt?
City Administrator Bob Quitz has indicated he has thoughts.
Yes, Councilmember Hunt, members of the committee, this is all kind of new. And I think one of the challenges we have is why things go on a regular agenda. I think there was a time things went on a regular agenda because you wanted to air it. You wanted to have the press write about it. You wanted to have people watch it at a meeting. Those things don't largely happen anymore. So perhaps another thought of a committee recommendation would be to the administration to say, yes, we'll place this on consent, but we would like the mayor to highlight this in the mayor's report. We'd like to have our communications group perhaps, do a little video that we could put on social media, because that, I think, is one of the reasons you put things on a regular, or at least it has been in the past. But again, if this is felt that there's not council discussion on the content, but really just how do you air this, there are other options. So that may be another recommendation the committee could make.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. I think this is new, but at the same time, if we as a committee don't have changes that we want to see, big changes that we feel need to be made, which I don't believe we do, and we also don't have different opinions that we want to make sure get across to council in the recommendation in case there's multiple perspectives on this committee, which I also am not hearing. I think it can be on consent, and I also agree that I think one of the pieces of this is the public awareness, and there are ways we could make sure that the community is aware of these changes that will better reach the community than putting it on regular business. And for our fellow council members, they can watch these meetings, which is one of the other benefits of this process, and so they can hear the presentation. So if we're looking to duplicate information, there's ways that council can get the same conversation already. So I think that's also a good reason that it can just go on consent. So that would be my my process at this point. If it doesn't have big changes, doesn't have controversy or differing perspectives that we would want to share, like a minority and majority opinion from our committee, which we don't have. So let's go forward with that. So I'll go ahead and make a motion to put the code enforcement ordinances adoption on the regular council meeting agenda for June 21st on the consent agenda. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right, great. And do we have any additional feedback for staff on this item? And do you have what you need on this item? All right, great. I'm not seeing any further questions. So that was great. And thank you both for being here and presenting, to Lori and Anne Marie. With that, we are at the end of our agenda this evening. I will give an opportunity if there are council members who would like to make any announcements that are timely that you would need to make. I'm not seeing any. So then with that, we can adjourn this committee meeting at 8:58 p.m. and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.